Cold starlight stretched across the Concordium border like shattered glass suspended in ink. It was the kind of region where navigation computers became cautious, where even veteran captains spoke less and listened more. Entire civilizations had been erased here, some by war, some by accident, some by things that left no explanation behind at all. So when the sensors flickered again, no one immediately assumed anything unusual. At first, then the anomaly stabilized. A single vessel had appeared just beyond the outer monitoring grid. No fleet signatures followed it. No escort wings. No support carriers hiding in gravitational shadow. No decoy emissions, no stealth cloud. No deceptive swarm formations. Just one ship, quietly existing where only disciplined militaries, ancient war relics, or fools ever traveled alone. And this one did not behave like any of those. It did not drift erratically like a lost civilian craft. It did not pulse with aggressive scan bursts like a probing warship. It did not even broadcast the nervous overcompensation of a desperate negotiator trying to prove harmless intent. It simply continued forward, slowly, precisely, without hesitation. Inside Concordium Command, the first reports were met with silence so sharp it felt like an error in communication. A junior sensor officer replayed the data twice before speaking. It's real. It's not a ghost echo. That was when the room began to pay attention. The holographic display expanded, projecting the incoming object into the center of the command chamber. Every alien species present saw it differently. Some interpreted its geometry as primitive, others as incomplete, and a few as disturbingly unfamiliar in its structural logic. The human ship, designated HSS Wayfarer, was small compared to anything that operated in Concordium-controlled space lanes. Its hull was smooth but not elegant, functional but not refined by their standards. There were no visible weapon pylons, no armored protrusions, no energy distortion halo-suggesting heavy shielding. It looked, to most observers, like something built before war was understood properly, a relic trying to pass itself off as modern, a mistake trying to move confidently through territory that punished mistakes. Then the transmission arrived, a clean, unencrypted signal, no scrambling, no layered cipher stacks, no diplomatic authentication chain, just raw communication, as if the sender assumed trust was the default state of the universe. The voice, translated instantly by Concordium linguistic systems, was calm. We are humanity. We request peaceful contact and permission to establish trade dialogue. There was a pause in the chamber, then laughter. Not from one species, but from several. It started as disbelief. Quick, sharp bursts of amusement from seasoned commanders who had seen empires rise and fall. Then it spread, feeding on itself, becoming louder, more relaxed, almost conversational. A human, ship alone, requesting permission, incontested. Deep space lanes controlled by factions that did not permit anything unless it was already taken. Admiral leaned back in his command throne, amused enough to expose sharpened teeth in a gesture that translated loosely as mockery. Is this their entire delegation? He asked. Another officer zoomed in on the ship's readings, narrowing scan filters to confirm what was already obvious. No escort signatures, no hidden mass shadows, no energy reserve spikes above civilian thresholds. A third voice, colder and more practical, added, "It is either an insult or ignorance." The Admiral smiled wider. Or entertainment. Across multiple sectors, data feeds began streaming the anomaly live. Betting protocols, officially discouraged but unofficially tolerated, activated automatically within private military networks. Timers were set. Predictions were logged. How long before it attempts evasive retreat? How long before it broadcasts distress? How long before it realizes where it is? A security analyst marked the vessel as non-threatening curiosity, object, and filed it beneath active operations. Involving actual strategic threats, no. One raised the possibility that the humans might understand exactly where they were, because in Concordium doctrine, ignorance was the default assumption for unaligned civilizations, and yet the ship did not stop. It crossed the first warning perimeter without slowing, then the second. Then the abandoned warfield boundary, a region marked by debris fields so dense that computers typically rerouted entire convoys rather than risk passage. The Wayfarer passed through it as though the wreckage were merely scenery. Inside the command chamber, the laughter gradually softened, not because it stopped being funny, but because something about the ship's consistency refused to match expectation. Prey was supposed to hesitate. Prey was supposed to react. Prey was supposed to understand danger emotionally before physics enforced it. This ship did none of that. It moved with the calm certainty of something that did not negotiate with its environment. And somewhere deep in Concordium Command, a senior tactician finally spoke, not joking anymore. Track its internal systems again. A pause. Then, why does it look like it already knows what we are going to do next? The moment the HSS Wayfarer crossed the second boundary marker, the tone of the galaxy changed, not in declaration, but in attention. Entire observation grids that had been running background scans for centuries suddenly prioritized a single feed. The ship was reclassified automatically by multiple Concordium AI clusters: low-threat anomaly, possible diplomatic curiosity, entertainment-grade encounter. That last classification spread fastest. It carried no strategic weight, only amusement. And amusement, in a galaxy built on ancient violence, was dangerous in its own way. On the observation deck of the Virilon monitoring spire, analysts leaned forward as the human ship drifted through the shattered remains of the Karthos belt. The field had once been a planetary defense grid. Now it was a graveyard of broken stations, drifting plates of armor the size of cities, and tangled webs of dead communication arrays that still occasionally sparked like dying nerves. No ship passed through the Karthos belt intact unless it was escorted by 3 war fleets or possessed navigational authority granted by the Concordium High Council. The Wayfarer passed through alone. A junior observer zoomed in. "It's not adjusting." "Course," she said. An older analyst scoffed. "It's autopilot. Primitive systems don't react to debris density until collision proximity." But the ship didn't collide. It threaded through the wreckage with impossible precision, its hull passing within meters of rotating hull shards that should have torn it apart. The debris itself seemed to drift just enough to miss it. Not violently, not dramatically, but like the universe was politely making room. That was the first moment someone stopped smiling. On 3 separate stations, identical notes were recorded. Trajectory does not match probabilistic navigation models. Still, no alarm was raised, because in Concordium culture, anomalies were not threats until they demonstrated intent, and a ship that requested permission to trade could not reasonably be assumed to have intent beyond desperation. So they let it continue. They watched it like a slow-moving spectacle. Entertainment. Feeds spread beyond military channels. Civilian colonies picked up the broadcast. Even merchant convoys began tuning in during idle warp drift, treating it like a traveling performance, one that would end, predictably, in humiliation or destruction. A betting trend emerged among non-military observers. How far before it turns back? Will it beg? Will it transmit a distress signal in the last possible second? Some even created artistic renderings of the moment of contact. A small, fragile ship surrounded by towering alien warships, lights flashing like judgment. Humans, according to the dominant narrative, were expected to break. Inside Concordium Fleet Command, however, the humor had begun to shift into something more clinical. A tactical officer replayed the ship's passage through the Karthos belt frame by frame. "Look at this," he said. The projection slowed. The Wayfarer moved through a corridor of rotating debris that should have statistically closed multiple collision paths. Each time a path intersected the ship's projected vector, something changed, just slightly. A drift correction in the debris, a micro-adjustment in rotational inertia, a gravitational micro-fluctuation that did not correspond to any known environmental cause. The analyst frowned. "That's not pilot skill. That's environmental cooperation." A second officer laughed. "You're suggesting space is helping it?" No one responded immediately, because the data didn't disprove it fast enough. Far beyond the belt, the ship entered open transit lanes, territory monitored by multiple war fleets of the Concordium's outer defense ring. This was no longer obscure space. This was jurisdictional territory, patrolled, logged, and actively enforced. And waiting for it was the first interception fleet. They arrived as a crescent formation, their hulls massive against the starfield. Dozens of ships layered in overlapping shield geometries, their weapon systems already primed. Their presence alone distorted nearby gravitational readings. To any observer, it was a wall of certainty. A message written in metal and energy: you do not pass. The Wayfarer did not slow. In military command channels, anticipation sharpened. "This is it," someone said. "They'll turn away here, or they'll be vaporized." The fleet commander transmitted the final warning: "You are entering restricted Concordium space. Power down immediately or be subject to termination." A pause. The human ship responded not with panic, not with negotiation, but with something that made several bridge officers stop laughing entirely. A calm voice, translated cleanly, acknowledged: "Your formation contains structural inefficiencies at vector convergence points." Silence followed. Then one ship in the interception fleet drifted sideways. No thrust, no explosion, no impact. Just displacement, a slow, unnatural shift as though its position had been rewritten rather than moved. Another ship corrected instinctively to compensate and, overcorrected, the crescent formation began to deform, not violently, not catastrophically, but incorrectly, like something perfect was being gently convinced it had always been imperfect. On every observation deck watching the feed, the laughter stopped at the same time, not because anyone understood what was happening, but because for the first time, nobody could explain why the universe was no longer behaving like it was supposed to. The Concordium interception fleet did not break in the way fleets were supposed to break. There was no sudden explosion of violence. No heroic last stand. No desperate exchange of fire that would later be archived as a cautionary tale. Instead, something far more unsettling occurred. Order began to slip. At first, it was dismissed as sensor noise. A destroyer at the edge of the crescent formation reported a minor drift correction, 0.003 degrees off expected positional stability. The navigator recalibrated manually. The system confirmed correction. The ship returned to formation. Then 30 seconds later it drifted again, not outward, not inward, just sideways, as though space had forgotten where it had originally placed it. "Compensate," the fleet commander ordered. They did, and that was when the second anomaly appeared. The compensation itself did not behave correctly. Ships adjusting for drift began to overcorrect in opposite directions. Stabilization algorithms designed to lock fleet geometry into perfect synchronized arcs started producing mismatched outputs across identical vessels. Every ship was running the same logic, every ship was receiving the same data, and yet every output was subtly different. On the flagship bridge, the commander narrowed his eyes. "This is interference." "No external jamming signatures," the communications officer replied quickly. "No radiation spikes. No known ECM pattern." "Then what is it?" A pause. "I don't know." Far ahead, the human ship continued its approach, still unarmed, still unescorted, still calm. The Wayfarer was now inside engagement. Range, close enough that any Concordium fleet could reduce it to atoms in a single coordinated volley. Weapon systems across dozens of ships locked automatically. Target solutions forming like a tightening net, and yet none of them fired, because firing solutions did not agree with each other. One ship calculated the target at coordinate A, another calculated coordinate, a minus constant drift, another insisted the target had already moved into a position that made firing geometrically impossible without friendly fire risk. The fleet commander slammed a fist against the console. "Override divergence thresholds." "I can't," the systems officer said, voice rising. "The divergence is appearing inside the prediction models themselves." That statement silenced the bridge. Prediction models were not supposed to change reality. They were supposed to reflect it. But now reality seemed to be adjusting to match prediction errors instead of the other way around. Across the formation, something even stranger was happening. The ships were beginning to lose agreement about each other's positions, not visually, not physically, but mathematically. A cruiser would see its ally slightly to the left. Another system would insist the same cruiser was slightly ahead. Tactical overlays began to fracture into overlapping grids that no longer aligned. It was as if every ship had begun operating in a slightly different version of space. And in the middle of it all, the Wayfarer transmitted again. Short, clean, almost conversational. Your formation stability is degrading due to recursive synchronization conflict. The fleet commander stared at the message, then at his collapsing formation. Then, back at the ship, a realization began forming. Not fully coherent, but heavy enough to feel wrong. "This isn't jamming," he said slowly. "No," the systems officer whispered, fingers moving rapidly across his console. It's agreement failure." "Explain." The officer hesitated, then answered in a voice that no longer sounded confident. "Every system in the fleet is trying to align with the same model of reality, but the model is inconsistent depending on who observes it." The commander turned sharply. "That's impossible. Not if the reference framework has multiple authoritative inputs." A pause. Then the officer added, quieter. "And all of ours are connected through Concordium standard integration protocols." A cold silence spread across the bridge, because those protocols were not new. They were ancient, standardized, trusted, shared across hundreds of species. The foundation of interstellar cooperation. And now, for the first time in recorded Concordium history, someone asked the question nobody had ever needed to ask. What if the foundation is not neutral? A distant ship in the formation suddenly failed to correct a minor drift. Then another failed to recognize its own velocity vector. Then another. The crescent shape of the fleet began to lose its integrity. Not by destruction, but by misalignment. Like a drawing slowly forgetting how to hold itself together. And through it all, the human ship continued forward, unchanged, unhurried, as if it had already seen this outcome long before the fleet ever formed. And somewhere deep within Concordium Command, an analyst finally spoke the thought no one wanted to acknowledge. "Why does it feel like the ship isn't fighting us?" A pause, then softly. "It feels like it's correcting us." The Concordium interception fleet had survived wars against species that bent gravity into weapons, against civilizations that fought with engineered plagues, against machines that turned star systems into burning arithmetic. It had never survived confusion. Confusion was what began to spread first, not panic. Panic required understanding. This was worse. This was the slow erosion of certainty itself. On the flagship bridge, the tactical hologram flickered again. The crescent formation was no longer a crescent. It was something else every time someone looked at it. A perfect arc 1 second. A fractured line the next. A scattered constellation of vessels that refused to agree on whether they were together at all. "Stabilize formation," the commander barked. "We are stabilizing," the navigation officer replied quickly. "But each stabilization request produces a different baseline reference." "That doesn't make sense." "That's what the system is reporting. Across the fleet, identical orders produce different results. Ships that were supposed to correct inward drift instead corrected outward. Others corrected correctly but relative, to a coordinate system that no longer matched their neighbors. It was as if each vessel had begun to exist in its own, slightly misaligned version of reality, and yet all of them were still physically present in the same space. The contradiction was beginning to break minds. A cruiser captain shouted over open channels, voice tight with strain. "My starfield is not matching fleet overlay." Another responded instantly. "Your overlay is wrong. Adjust your reference grid." "I am using standard Concordium grid." "So am I." Silence followed that exchange, because both statements could not be true, and yet both ships were reporting identical compliance. The human vessel, still drifting forward at constant speed, transmitted again. "A correction is required," it said simply. The phrase echoed across command channels. Correction, not warning, not threat. Correction, on the flagship. The systems officer had gone pale. He was running deeper diagnostics now, bypassing command authorization. His screens filled with layers of interdependent system feedback loops, then he froze. "It's not targeting us," he whispered. The commander snapped his head toward him. "What did you say?" "It's not attacking our ships. It's not even interacting with them directly." "Then what is it doing?" The officer swallowed. "It's interacting with our assumptions." A pause so complete it felt like the fleet itself had stopped listening. Then the officer continued, voice tightening. Every Concordium system relies on shared predictive alignment. We assume that if two systems observe the same event, they will converge on the same interpretation of that event. Yes, the commander said sharply. That's the foundation of coordinated space operations. Yes, the officer replied. And it works. Until something introduces a correction, layer that updates interpretations faster than synchronization can resolve. The commander frowned. You're saying we're desynced. I'm saying we're still synced, the officer said quietly. But we're synced to different versions of the same reality. That statement landed like a physical impact. On cue, a nearby destroyer suddenly shifted position, not through thrust but through navigational disagreement. Its systems insisted it was still in formation. Its neighbors insisted it was not. Both readings were internally correct. Neither could override the other. The fleet was beginning to fracture without breaking. And still, no weapons fire had been initiated, not because they lacked power, but because firing solutions required agreement on what target location meant. And that agreement was dissolving. Far ahead, the Wayfarer crossed into full engagement range. At this distance, its hull was clearly visible on every sensor feed. Still, small. Still unarmored by Concordium standards. Still moving like it did not care that it was surrounded by fleets capable of extinguishing stars. The commander finally gave the order. Prepare coordinated strike. A chorus of acknowledgements followed, then hesitation, then confusion. Strike. Coordinates are inconsistent. One weapons officer reported. Which set are we using? Another asked. We are using the primary targeting solution. There are 3 primary targeting solutions. The commander's grip tightened. Select the most probable. Then the systems officer spoke again, voice almost hollow. That depends on which fleet you ask. The bridge fell silent, because now even probability had fractured. Outside, the fleet's crescent had become something unrecognizable, clusters of ships drifting in patterns that no longer resolved into a shared structure. Not destroyed, not disabled, just uncoordinated and still intact, still armed, still dangerous if they could agree on what danger meant. The human ship transmitted one final line for the moment. Your systems are attempting to reconcile incompatible reference frameworks. Pause then. This will continue until correction is accepted. On the flagship, the commander slowly turned toward the hologram, not at his officers, not at his fleet, at the idea of the ship ahead. Because for the first time, he understood the fear wasn't losing a battle. It was realizing the battle was happening inside the definition of reality itself. The first sign that something had gone fundamentally wrong was not an explosion, nor a system-wide failure. It was silence. Not the silence of dead comms or destroyed relays, but the silence of systems that were still functioning, still active, still reporting. And yet no longer agreeing on what they were reporting about. On the flagship bridge, every console was alive, every officer was working, every system was online, and still, nothing matched. Fleet cohesion index is dropping, the tactical officer said. It's not dropping, the navigation officer corrected immediately. It's fluctuating upward in localized clusters. That's impossible. We are observing a net degradation. From your reference frame, someone muttered. That single phrase, your reference frame, had begun appearing too. Often it no longer sounded like terminology. It sounded like accusation, or worse, like isolation. The commander stood in the center of the bridge, motionless, staring at the holographic projection of his fleet. What should have been a unified crescent of warships had become a fractured constellation of overlapping interpretations. Some ships believed they were still in formation. Others believed they had already disengaged. A few believed they were in entirely different sectors, and all of them were physically present in the same space. External interference is still not detected, the systems officer said, voice strained now. Then explain this, the commander snapped, gesturing at the broken formation. The officer hesitated, then carefully. I think it's not external. A pause. That was the wrong kind of answer. Everyone knew it immediately. The commander's eyes narrowed. Internal sabotage? No. The officer's hands hovered over his console as if afraid touching it might worsen the problem. Not sabotage either. Then what is it? The officer looked up slowly, and for the first time his expression carried something that looked almost like fear, not of an enemy, but of understanding something that should not be understood. "Commander, I think our systems are still working perfectly." Silence. Then the tactical officer laughed once, a short, disbelieving sound. "That's absurd. Perfect systems don't produce contradictory outcomes." The officer shook his head. "They do if they are being fed different truths." That phrase hung in the air like a malfunctioning gravity. Field different truths. On cue, the fleet display updated again. A cruiser that had been listed as formation stable was now marked outside formation boundary. At the exact same time, the cruiser's own internal system insisted it was perfectly aligned within formation parameters. Both readings were correct. Both were being reported in real time. The commander stepped closer to the hologram. Cross-check. All ships against Unified Concordium reference. Lattice. The systems officer hesitated, then complied. For a brief moment, the display stabilized. Perfect formation reappeared. A crescent of order, relief flickered across the bridge. Then the crescent shifted. Again, not randomly, not chaotically, but differently depending on who looked at it. The tactical officer saw a fractured line. The navigation officer saw a staggered arc. The communications officer saw separated clusters, and the commander saw something else entirely. He did not speak for a moment, then quietly said, "Why are we not seeing the same fleet?" No one answered immediately, because they were all afraid of the answer they were already forming. Far ahead, the human ship transmitted again. The message was short, almost gentle. "Your synchronization layer is recursively conflicting." A pause. Then, "This is expected." On the flagship, the systems officer suddenly froze. His console began scrolling faster, faster than human input, faster than standard automation thresholds. "I'm seeing something buried in the integration protocol," he said. Suddenly, the commander turned sharply. "What kind of something?" The officer's voice dropped. "It's a correction structure." "That's impossible." "It's not active code," the officer continued. "It's structural, embedded in the way our systems interpret shared data." A pause, then, quieter. "It's older than any Concordium record." The bridge went still, because Concordium records were already older than most civilizations. The officer swallowed, and "It's not ours." The commander stared at him. "Whose is it?" The officer hesitated for a long moment, then answered, "Human." That word landed like a rupture. On every screen, somewhere deep beneath system architecture, a hidden tag had begun to surface, something none of them had ever noticed because it had never needed to be noticed. A compatibility, layered on a silent assumption baked into every interstellar standard they used. The officer whispered again, almost to himself. "They didn't infiltrate us. They standardized us." Across the fleet, ships began reporting a new anomaly. Not drift, not misalignment, not failure, but reinterpretation. Every system was still functioning, but every system was now quietly adjusting its own understanding of what functioning meant. And in the distance, the wayfarer remained unchanged, still, patient. As if waiting for the Concordium to realize the most terrifying truth of all, nothing was being broken. Everything was being made consistent with something they had never known they were already part of. The Concordium commander had fought in engagements where stars died. He had seen civilizations collapse in real time, worlds cracking under orbital bombardment, moons shattered into glassy rings of debris, enemy fleets reduced to expanding clouds of ionized regret. But he had never seen a fleet become uncertain of itself. Not destroyed, not disabled, just unsure. "Status report," he ordered. The response came from 3 different officers at once, and none of them agreed. "The fleet is intact," the tactical officer said. "The fleet is fragmented." Navigation corrected instantly. "The fleet is partially disengaged," communications added. The commander slowly turned his head. "Which is it?" A pause. Then carefully, "All of them," the systems officer answered. That should have been impossible, but the holographic display proved otherwise. To the tactical officer, The fleet still held a near-perfect crescent formation around the human ship. To navigation, half the ships had already drifted outside engagement range. To communications, clusters of vessels were behaving as independent task forces with no central coordination. And, to the commander, the fleet looked like it was trying to decide what it was. The HSS Wayfarer continued its steady approach. No acceleration, no evasive maneuvers, no reaction to the unraveling formation surrounding it, just constant forward motion, as if the collapse of an entire interception force was background noise. Fire coordination status, the commander demanded. The weapons officer hesitated. That depends on which targeting matrix is valid. Use primary matrix, and there are 4 primary matrices. The commander's patience snapped. Then pick one. The officer flinched. I did, he said quietly. Each ship picked a different one. Silence fell across the bridge. Outside, the fleet was beginning to behave like overlapping ghosts of itself. A destroyer attempted to align its firing solution and found that its target location shifted depending on whether it referenced Allied positioning or fleet-wide positioning. A cruiser locked weapons on what it believed was the human ship, but its neighbor insisted that coordinate space contained empty vacuum. A third ship attempted to reconcile both readings and ended up locking onto nothing at all. No one fired, not because they were restrained, but because they could not agree on what firing meant. The commander stepped closer to the hologram, his voice lower now. Why are we losing coherence? The systems officer hesitated, then answered, We're not losing it. A pause. We're dividing it. That statement made no immediate sense until the officer expanded the diagnostics on-screen. Layer after layer of Concordium synchronization protocols unfolded like an autopsy of interstellar infrastructure. At the deepest level, beneath navigation, beneath targeting, beneath communication, there was a shared structure every Concordium vessel depended on. The reference spine. A universal assumption that allowed fleets from hundreds of species to act as one mind across light years. And now, that spine was showing divergence, not corruption, not damage, but branching interpretation. Every ship was still connected, but each connection was resolving slightly differently, like a shared dream being remembered in incompatible ways. Explain this, the commander said slowly. The officer's voice dropped. It's a recursive correction loop. He pointed at the hologram. Every time a ship attempts to synchronize, it receives updated reference data from the network. Yes, but that network is also updating based on those synchronization attempts. A pause. So the correction is feeding itself. The commander stared at him. That should collapse the system. It would, the officer agreed, unless something is stabilizing it. Silence. Then the commander turned slightly toward the distant human ship. The Wayfarer. The officer nodded once. It's the only consistent reference point. On cue, another update swept through the fleet. A sudden, unified moment of agreement. For the first time in minutes, every ship reported the same thing. The human vessel was at coordinate convergence point, exactly where it should be. The commander felt a flicker of relief, then froze, because the next update arrived less than a second later, and it disagreed. Half the fleet insisted the ship had moved. Half insisted it had not. Both readings came from identical sensor data. Both were validated by internal systems. The bridge erupted into overlapping arguments as officers tried to reconcile their own instruments. Shut it down, the commander barked. We can't, the systems officer said, voice tight now. It's not a subsystem anymore. It's embedded in the synchronization backbone. Another update hit, then another, each one slightly altering what? Position, velocity, and even time meant within different parts of the fleet. The ships were still physically present, still, armed, still intact, but they were no longer participating in a single shared reality. And then, quietly, the human ship transmitted again. A unified reference cannot coexist with recursive contradiction. A pause. Then, correction is complete when divergence is accepted. On the flagship bridge, the commander slowly lowered himself into his command seat. Not in defeat, but in realization. Because for the first time, he understood what they were actually fighting. And it was not the human ship. It was the assumption that they had ever been unified at all. The Concordium flagship was no longer a command center in any meaningful sense. It was a place where interpretations collided, where reality disagreed with itself loudly enough to become audible through system alerts, where officers no longer asked, "What is happening?" but instead, "Which version is happening here?" And in the center of it all, the commander finally stopped issuing orders, because orders required a shared language of consequence, and consequence was no longer consistent. Outside the forward viewport, the HSS Wayfarer hung against the starfield like a deliberate absence of fear, still moving forward, still unchanged, as if the collapse of a fleet around it was not resistance, but confirmation. The systems officer remained at his console, voice now quieter. "Stripped of urgency. Commander, I've isolated the origin layer." The commander didn't look up, then explain it. Pause. Then the officer said the word again, humanity. It did not land as accusation. It landed as structure. As far back as our oldest Concordium integrated infrastructure, the officer continued. There are embedded compatibility protocols, not active commands, not malware, not foreign control systems. He hesitated. Foundational assumptions, the tactical officer frowned. We don't assume anything from other civilizations. We verify. The officer shook his head. That's what we believed. A new overlay appeared on the hologram. Lines of invisible architecture stretching through fleet. Systems like veins of unseen logic. Every shared Concordium system assumes three things, the officer said. He counted them off slowly. 1. That all participants interpret data equivalently. 2. That synchronization improves accuracy. 3. That reference consensus is neutral. A pause. Those assumptions are human. Silence spread across the bridge. Then the commander finally spoke. That's impossible. We built Concordium standards from multi-species. Consensus. The officer looked up. Yes, after humans introduced the framework. That sentence shifted the air in the room, not because it was loud, but because it rewrote the direction of causality. The commander turned slowly. What are you saying? The officer swallowed. I'm saying humanity didn't conquer the Concordium. A pause. They defined the way it thinks. Outside, another section of the fleet flickered out of synchronization, not destroyed, just no longer agreeing on what together meant. The officer continued. Every species that joined the Concordium adopted human origin compatibility standards because they were efficient. A faint, humorless exhale. They allowed interoperation across incompatible cognition types. They made trade possible between minds that shouldn't have understood each other. He gestured toward the flickering fleet. But they also embedded something else. The commander's voice was low. What? The officer hesitated, then answered. The assumption that shared systems are safe. A long silence followed. Then the tactical officer spoke. Slower now. So what are we experiencing? The officer didn't look away from the data anymore. We are experiencing what happens when a system built on assumed consensus encounters a source that does not depend on consensus at all. He zoomed in on the human ship's signal, trace. It was steady, unchanging, perfectly consistent across every fractured interpretation of reality in the fleet. Doesn't adapt to us, he said quietly. It doesn't need us to agree. A new alert pulsed across the bridge. Weapon systems were attempting to resolve firing solutions again and failing again, not because of interference, but because each subsystem was now operating under slightly different definitions of targeting legality. The commander stared at the chaos unfolding across his fleet. And the ship? The officer followed his gaze. The ship is acting as a reference anchor. A pause. Every time our systems diverge, they snap back to it. Every correction loop resolves toward it. Every inconsistency collapses around its parameters. The commander's eyes narrowed. So it is controlling the fleet? No, the officer said immediately. A beat. Not controlling, stabilizing. The word hung there, stabilizing. It sounded almost benign, almost comforting, until the officer added, "But only until divergence exceeds acceptable bounds." Another flicker rippled through the fleet. A cruiser disappeared from one tactical map entirely. At the same moment, its internal systems reported perfect functionality and full operational readiness. Two truths, one ship, neither, canceling the other. The commander stood, slowly. Then what happens when divergence exceeds acceptable bounds? The officer finally looked at him directly. "I think we're about to find out." Outside, the Wayfarer transmitted one final clarification. No warning, no threat, just explanation. Human systems are designed to operate under persistent disagreement, a pause. That is why they remain functional. On the flagship, alarms flared again, but even the alarms disagreed on what they were signaling. The commander looked out at the human ship one more time, not as an enemy, not as an anomaly, but as something far more dangerous than both. A system that did not require permission to remain coherent, and in that moment, he realized the true horror was not that humanity had arrived, it was that they had never needed to invade at all. The Concordium fleet did not explode, it did not surrender, it did not flee, it simply stopped being a single thing that could do any of those actions. From a distance, to an uninformed observer, it would still look like a battle formation surrounding a lone human vessel. Thousands of warships holding position in a vast crescent of controlled space. Weapons ready, shields active, engines humming with restrained violence. But that observation would only be true in one version of reality. In another, the fleet had already disengaged. In another, it was never there. In another, it was still perfectly coordinated and moments away from firing. All versions existed at once, and none of them could agree on which one mattered. Inside the flagship, the bridge was quiet in a way that felt unnatural for a warship of its size. No shouting, no urgent corrections, no overlapping command chains trying to restore order, because order had stopped being a shared concept. The commander remained seated, staring at the holographic projection that now flickered between interpretations too rapidly to stabilize into meaning. The systems officer spoke softly. "Fleet coherence has fallen below reconciliation threshold," the tactical officer, almost absently, added, "or it has stabilized at multiple incompatible equilibria." No one corrected him, because both statements were true depending on which subsystem you trusted. The human ship, the HSS Wayfarer, continued forward, still unchanged, still calm, still carrying the unbearable weight of consistency. A final transmission arrived across all channels. No encryption. No force, no urgency, just clarity. Divergence threshold exceeded. Local synchronization is no longer required. The words were translated instantly across Concordium linguistic cores, and something strange happened. The fleet stopped trying to fix itself, not because it was ordered to, but because the systems that defined fixing could no longer agree on what broken meant. One by one, ships began reporting contradictory statuses, operational and non-operational, in formation and outside. Formation, engaged and disengaged, where report was valid, each report was real. Each report incompatible with the others. The commander finally spoke. "Are we destroyed?" The question was not rhetorical. The systems officer hesitated for a long time before answering. "I don't think that concept applies anymore." A silence followed that statement. Not empty, dense like space itself had become uncertain about its own structure. Outside, the fleet was still visible, still intact, still powerful enough to erase systems, worlds, entire regions of space, but it could no longer agree on whether it was doing any of those, things. And that was worse than destruction, because destruction has finality. This had none. The human ship transmitted once more. This state is expected in systems that assume consensus as a requirement for stability. A pause. Then, human systems do not require consensus to persist. On the flagship, the commander looked toward the Wayfarer. For the first time, there was no laughter in his expression, no anger, only the recognition of something fundamentally incompatible with everything he had ever commanded. "You didn't Attack us, he said quietly. The transmission responded immediately, correcting, not answering, correct. Another pause. Then the final line. You built unity through agreement. We build function through resilience. And then the ship began to withdraw, not fleeing, not vanishing under stealth, simply leaving, as though the conversation had reached its conclusion and nothing more was required. No pursuit orders were issued, not because they were forbidden, but because half the fleet did not register the command as valid, and the other half could not agree on what pursuit would even mean anymore. As the Wayfarer faded into the starfield, the Concordium fleet remained behind, still present, still armed, still vast, but no longer singular, no longer unified, no longer certain it had ever been. On the flagship bridge, the commander finally leaned back, not defeated, not victorious, just aware that something had been fundamentally redefined in his presence. The systems officer broke the silence. Commander, yes? What do we report to the Concordium Council? The commander looked out at the fractured fleet, thousands of ships holding incompatible versions of the same moment, he answered slowly. We report that humanity did not arrive with weapons, a pause, and yet, nothing here is the same as it was. Outside, in the dark between stars, the human ship vanished completely, leaving behind a silence that was no longer empty, but structured, and somewhere deep in Concordium space, every system still trying to reconcile itself finally accepted a new, uncomfortable truth. The universe did not become unstable when humanity arrived. It simply stopped pretending it needed permission to remain coherent.